Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Jackson, and I'm Vice President of NCSS. Today, I have the privilege of introducing a farm boy from Oregon. Nicholas Kristof, our speaker, has championed the rights of the disenfranchised as a writer for the New York Times, columnist, blogger since 2011, a runner-up for since 2001, and a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize in 2011. His work, A Path Appears, is a story that you will get to see just a clip from, but that story talks about the women and children in countries where even in the United States, where abuse occurs. I read his article just now about immigration. He is a columnist who gives both sides of the story. He gave 5 myths about immigration, and then gave both sides. So he is a teacher to help us to teach our students how to think, not what to think. It is my privilege today to introduce New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof.
Peggy. Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be here, and on behalf of those various social studies teachers who helped me enormously over the years, Mrs. Trantina and Mrs. Creer and Coach Turner, I want to thank all of you. Anybody here from the great state of Oregon? All right, okay. Oregon makes up in quality what it lacks in quantity, but thank all of you. I know a number of you used Half the Sky, either the book or the documentary in classes. Thank you for that. It's an important way of reaching out to folks. And Cheryl, my co-author and wife, sends her best. Cheryl is in New York right now. We rarely travel together because our baby is now a high school senior. And, if we tended to travel together, our house would be the scene of the wildest parties you can imagine. So it seemed most prudent for us to divide our efforts, but she sends her very best. And let me tell you a little bit about how A Path Appears came about. After we wrote Half the Sky, then people kept coming and asking us, so what can I do? And there really is this yearning on the part of so many people to find a way of making a difference, of having an impact. And yet I think there's also a frustration that the challenges seem so immense, that there are issues of corruption, of inefficiency. People wonder whether they really can have an effect. And it does seem to us that people truly can. And part of that is new platforms, and part of that is new research about what makes a difference. The platforms vary from new kind of entities, from hybrids of for-profit companies to non-profit companies to new internet platforms. One person we found inspiration from was truly a kid, this 8-year-old girl, Rachel Beckwith, a girl from Seattle. Anybody here from Washington State? Oh, okay. Do you guys know Rachel's story? Yeah. So Rachel is 8 years old in this picture, and she heard through her church about how there were so many kids worldwide who didn't have access to clean water. She was moved by that. Don't have clean water? And so she decided to start a birthday page for her 9th birthday on the Charity Water website. Do you know Charity Water? Yeah. So in lieu of birthday presents, she asked for donations to this site, and she set a goal of raising $300. She was a little bit bummed out when, in the end, she only managed to raise $220. Then, a few weeks later, she was in a bad car accident outside Seattle. She was in the hospital, fighting for her life. Friends, members of the community wanted to show support for her and her family, wanted to show solidarity. They thought of her birthday page on Charity Water, and they went to it and began to donate. The total raised surged past that $300 original goal, past 500, past 1,000, past 5,000, and soon her parents were able to whisper to her that she had set a new Charity Water birthday record by beating the record that Justin Bieber had previously set, which would have tickled her immensely. Well, in the end, Rachel did not make it. She died as a consequence of that car crash. And I just saw her mom, Samantha Paul, in Seattle about a month ago, and obviously there is nothing that can salve the pain of a parent of losing their 9-year-old daughter. But Samantha also did get a chance to visit Ethiopia, where the money raised on Rachel's webpage was used to build wells. In the end, Rachel's page raised $1.2 million. Enough for water for 30,000 people. Yeah, let's give Rachel a hand. And her mom saw these kinds of markers that were put on all these wells across Ethiopia. And she says that it was a way not only of commemorating her daughter, but also of putting an overlay of meaning and purpose on an event that otherwise had just seemed so, not just tragic, but frustratingly random. And I do think, in a larger sense, that's what these kinds of efforts can do for all of us, that we're busy, we're hectic, and our lives are often kind of frustratingly random. And if we do find some way of connecting to a cause that is larger than ourselves, or helping students connect to that cause, it does provide this overlay of purpose and meaning to otherwise frustratingly random lives. The other thing that is relatively new in this field is the research, the robustness of the research. It gives us a sense of where we really can have an impact. You know, it used to be that we would maybe write a check or volunteer without really having much of a sense of what it was accomplishing. And these days, there has been pretty robust, careful research measuring anti-poverty interventions as if they were pharmaceutical trials. And we're learning some lessons, some of them tough, about what works, what doesn't work. There had been a lot of excitement about microfinance, about micro-lending in recent years. When it was carefully studied, it turned out that micro-lending it worked, but it was much less transformative than we had hoped. On the other hand, micro-savings, helping people save small amounts of money, really was transformative. Micro-savings was much more effective than micro-lending. In this country, one of the most cost-effective interventions turns out to be providing birth control support for at-risk teenagers who want it. In this country right now, almost 1/3 of teenage girls become pregnant by age 19. And because every Medicaid paid for childbirth costs $12,000, and because a long-acting reversible contraceptive costs about $600, these interventions helping these girls who don't want to get pregnant, helping them with access to contraceptive pays for itself more than 6 times over. Then there's education. I'm a great believer that maybe the best escalator out of poverty, whether you're talking about Tanzania or whether you're talking about Boston, is education. Well, what is the best way of getting one more kid in school, especially abroad, where there's still so many kids who aren't going to school? Well, in other countries, the study was done in Kenya, it turned out that by far the most cost-effective way wasn't to build a new school. It was something that we tend not to have thought about. Any guesses about what that is from anybody who hasn't read A Path Appears? Not teacher training. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with a medicine that would be in many of your homes, but that almost none of you, or maybe none of you, have ever taken. How's that for a riddle? It's deworming. We don't think about deworming because our kids don't have intestinal parasites. In much of the world, they do. And when children do have intestinal worms, they're more anemic, they're more sick, they miss school more often. And so here are the metrics of the cost of getting one marginal child in school in Kenya. If you do it through bricks and mortar construction, it's $350 per marginal child. If you do it through subsidizing school uniforms, which crazily are still required, it's $100. If you do it through deworming kids, one pill once a year typically, one pill of albendazole, then it's $3.50. And so we're getting this much richer sense of how to have an impact, how to have more confidence that one is having an impact. And yet one of the frustrations is that we tend not to implement this research, either in this country or in other countries. And that's true even when these are interventions, as in the case of family planning, as I mentioned earlier, that would actually save public money. Now, why is it? Why don't we use this research? And, frankly, I think that the reason, and it's a basic obstacle in addressing so many of these issues, is something of an empathy gap. And whenever I write about human needs, I encounter that empathy gap, and I'm sure a lot of you do in teaching it. One gauge of the empathy gap is that in the U.S., the wealthiest 20% of Americans donate significantly less to charity than the poorest 20%, even though the poorest 20% don't actually get the tax benefit of the charitable deduction because they're normally not itemizing deductions. Well, why is it? Why don't affluent people give as much as the poor as a fraction of incomes? I don't think it's because the affluent are inherently less empathetic or less compassionate, less good than anybody else. Rather, it seems to be because if you are well off in America today, then you essentially insulate yourself from need. You live in a nice neighborhood. Your friends and acquaintances tend to be pretty well off as well. And in contrast, if you are poor in America today, then every day you encounter people who are even needier than yourself. And confronted by that need, you respond and reach in your pocket and help. And indeed, one of the things that has been distressing is that for those who are affluent and have insulated themselves from that need, then there sometimes also is a tendency to dehumanize those who need that help. Susan Fiske at Princeton University did some fascinating studies where she did brain scans on successful people as they were looking at images of people who were poor or homeless. And she found that the brain processed those images as if they were looking not at people, but at things. That's what we have to chip away at, and that's the challenge of the empathy gap. And I think that, at the end of the day, there are no perfect solutions, but I do think that education is the best moment we have to try to build that empathy in ways that will help affect society for decades and decades after that, giving kids who have been insulated from need some interaction, whether it's through books or documentaries or whatever activity it may be, some encounter with those who have been less fortunate. And Cheryl and I have 3 kids. This is something we obviously care about as parents. We want our kids to be empathetic. We struggle with it. I mean, I think everybody knows that if you tell kids to be empathetic, it doesn't get you very far. It's about modeling behavior. It's about showing them people who are in greater need. One of our approaches has been, since I'm off reporting a lot around the world, then to drag our kids along on these trips. I remember our daughter, the same one who's now a high school senior, Caroline, maybe 4 years ago when she was, she must have been either an 8th grader or a 9th grader. I was on a reporting trip in Central America, and I was dragging her through a slum in Honduras and saying, Caroline, pretty soon we'll be in rural Nicaragua. She turned to me and said, Dad, when my friends go on vacation, they go to the Caribbean. And so Cheryl and I talked it over, and we decided that Caroline really had a point. And actually, our next family vacation, we went to the Caribbean over Thanksgiving break. We went to Haiti during the cholera outbreak. So we have our own, imperfect efforts to expose our kids to some of these needs, and I do think at the end of the day, this is the best route to try to create more empathetic societies, to start when kids are young and to introduce them to needs. And there's been a lot of debate about service requirements, and I think we all know that sometimes kids enter into them with thoughts that this is just going to dress up a college application. But I really do think that even when it's entered into for cynical reasons, that as long as kids do encounter somebody who is a little less fortunate in some way, that does leave an impression. And likewise, service trips abroad, I don't think at the end of the day they have a huge impact on kids abroad. I remember hearing about one Mexican clinic that over the course of a summer was painted 8 times by successive waves of high school students. But whatever the impact on the other country, I do think it helps create a constituency in this country of, kids who have encountered others who are needy. And I do hope and think that does leave an imprint in ways that are hard to measure, but over time can have an effect. And that's the domain of social studies teachers, so thank you for that. Well, this goes to a question of how we can, what happens if we're not pointing fingers, but chipping away at the empathy gap and offering a helping hand. And so let me tell you the story of Ollie Neal. This gentleman grew up in rural Arkansas, went to a segregated school, very, very smart kid, but kind of a troublemaker. He was caught shoplifting at the store where he worked, fired from his job. At this school, there was a sainted librarian, Mrs. Grady, and he reduced her to tears. One day, he was skipping English class, and he went to Mrs. Grady's little library in this segregated school, and he's browsing, and he notices a novel by an African-American author named Frank Yerby. I don't know if any of you remember the Frank Yerby book. So it struck him because it had as he describes it, it had a cover with a woman who was wearing this risque top. And I've always sort of wondered about that because this is 1957, and I don't know what a risque top could possibly mean in 1957. But whatever it did, it caught his eye, and he was looking at it, and he thought he'd kind of like to read it, but he's a tough kid, and tough kids don't read books. So he agonizes for a moment, then he just puts it under his jacket and walks out. He steals it. Well, he reads it at home, and it's a great novel. He really enjoys it. So a week or so later, he takes it back, puts it back on the shelf in the library, and he notices there's another Frank Yerby novel. So he steals that one, walks out, reads it at home, and again, it's a great read. He eventually returns it and notices that there's a third Frank Yerby novel that he'd never noticed before. He steals that. This happens 4 times. It turns Ollie Neal into a reader who loves reading. He graduates to more literary fiction. He moves on to current events. He goes on to college. He ends up going to law school, becomes one of Arkansas's first African-American lawyers, a leader in the civil rights movement, and devoted throughout his career to helping disadvantaged kids like the one that he had once been. Eventually becomes a prosecutor and a judge in Arkansas. That picture you saw earlier, that was of him in his judge's chambers. Well, he goes back to his school reunions, and at one of these reunions, he tells Mrs. Grady, you know, it was your little library that completely turned my life around. But I got a confession to make. I stole some of your books. And Mrs. Grady says, well, Ollie, I have a confession too. I saw you steal that first book. She had seen him steal it, and she was thinking, you know, she was angry. Why are you stealing a book when you can just check it out? And then she understood in this flash of empathy that he was embarrassed to be seen checking out a book. So she let him steal it. And then even though this is a tough, obnoxious kid who has reduced her to tears, that weekend she drives 70 miles to Memphis to the used bookstores there to search for another Frank Yerby book. The first bookstore doesn't have one. The second one doesn't have one. Finally, the third or fourth, she can't remember what, the third or fourth bookstore had a Frank Yerby novel. She bought it with her own dime, drove back 70 miles, put it on the shelf, and when Ollie Neal stole that second Frank Yerby book, she was thrilled. Then she went back to Memphis, bought another, and this happened 4 times, and it turned his life around. And, you know, look, helping people is harder than it looks. And I'm sure any of you know, if you've ever tried these efforts, you've had your heart broken by people you took a risk on and it didn't pan out. But every now and then, if one is willing to overcome that empathy gap and take a risk on somebody, maybe even a tough, obnoxious kid who doesn't quite deserve it, then sometimes it will have this remarkable effect, not only on that person, but ripple through them and on into the lives of so many others. And if we do that, then we're also chipping away at another kind of a gap, the inequality gap. And this is a big issue in the U.S. these days. I'm sure you know some of the data points on it. Here in the U.S., the wealthiest 1% own more than the bottom 90%. The black-white wealth gap in this country is greater than the black-white wealth gap was in South Africa and apartheid in 1970. And yet, we tend to measure inequality in metrics of wealth or income. And yet, at the end of the day, the even greater inequality gap is not about wealth or income. It's about opportunity. And as long as we can look at an infant in some zip codes and predict that that child is more likely to end up in prison than in college, then we have a profound gap of opportunity, and it's not just that child who is victimized by it, but all of society. The basic aphorism of this century is that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And that is why we need to try to address this opportunity gap. And I wonder sometimes whether liberals like myself shouldn't use the word inequality less, because I think inequality for conservatives connotes inequality of outcomes, and whether we shouldn't use the word opportunity more. I saw one poll of Americans in which 97% of Americans agreed that there should be greater efforts to create broader opportunity early in life. 97%. 97% of Americans don't agree that the world is round. If there is a chance to make progress on changing our language, then I think we can. I think one reason we haven't accomplished more in addressing these opportunity gaps is that often we start too late. And I'm sure all of you know better than I that it's often easier to help a 6-month-old or a 6-year-old than it is a troubled 16-year-old. And we saw this so much in our reporting for A Path Appears. One of the people we talk about in both the book and the documentary is this child, Johnny, in West Virginia. Johnny grew up in a low-income household. He had ear infections that were not addressed. He went completely deaf in one ear, mostly deaf in the other. He's now 4 years old, and he can't speak because this hearing impairment there were supposed to be hearing screenings. He did not get one until finally Save the Children intervened, and they found out that he was deaf, and they quite easily repaired the hearing problem. But by that point, his brain had been developing, and it wasn't getting any of this auditory stimulation as this brain is developing. And so we don't know whether he will ever recover the ability to speak properly. 50 or 60 years from now, he may still not be able to fully contribute to society because we dropped the ball on our watch. And periodically one hears people talk about irresponsibility on the part of the poor, and how the key is to develop greater personal responsibility. And let's be blunt. Sure, there are issues there, and there are pathologies, self-destructive behaviors that sometimes go along with poverty. And so I'm all for emphasizing personal responsibility, but I think we also need to look at the personal responsibility of society as a whole. When we drop the ball on kids and don't give them the support they need early on, we can't blame Johnny. We can blame the larger society for letting him slip. And it's not just hearing screenings. There are so many interventions. And I think one of the things we've learned in the last 10 years or so is something about the biochemistry, if you wish, of poverty. And we quote this neuroscientist as saying that growing up poor is bad for your brain. And you may know that when children grow up under what is called toxic stress associated with poverty, then it produces the stress hormone cortisol. Cortisol now and again is good for our brains, but when a child's brain is bathed in cortisol from this constant stress, then it prepares that child, in evolutionary terms, for a lifetime of stress, of danger. That child is put on a hair trigger, fight or flight response, and is less able to focus on one thing because they're always being prepared to look out for dangers behind them. Some of the, this has to go, in a sense, with something that is hard to talk about. It's politically incorrect to some degree to talk about, which is parenting gaps. It has to do with a deficit of words and hugs. You may know that children, professionals, and children on welfare begin to speak at the same time. There's no innate verbal gap there. But because children and professionals are hearing so much more, being spoken to so much more, by age 4, they have heard 30 million more words. It's a huge, huge advantage as that brain is developed to have that much more verbal stimulation. And then there's this deficit of hugs, if you will. The importance of this emerged originally in a study by a scientist who was working with rats. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to find a slide of hugging rats. But this scientist, Michael Meany, he noticed that rat parenting styles vary just quite a bit, very, very naturally. And some rat moms are, natural huggers and lickers, and other rat moms are kind of paws off. And so he wondered about the implications of this. So he followed the rats as adults, and he found that those rats who had been hugged and licked as babies, that they lived longer, they had better health markers, they were more self-confident, and they did better in mazes. So we thought, well, maybe this is somehow biologically transmitted, maybe this is genetic. And so he swapped the rats at birth and took the ones from the lickers and gave them to the paws-off moms and vice versa. And it didn't matter actually who your biological mom was. What mattered was whether you were actually licked as a baby rat. And it seems that the pathway for that is that being a baby rat is stressful. The baby rat is producing all this cortisol that is affecting brain development. And when that rat is being licked and cuddled, that disperses the cortisol. As with rats, as with humans. And the implication that some people draw is, well, this is kind of hopeless, this is about parenting, not much we can do, and this is absolutely wrong. Parents, with occasional exceptions, really want the best for their kids. And they, on the other hand, though, they do tend to raise kids the way they were raised. And if they don't appreciate the importance of having books at home, reading to their children, speaking to their children, a positive reinforcement, then those kids may not get it. And one of the people who really came to understand the ability of us to shape these early childhood outcomes through coaching parents is this fellow, David Olds. He was this is about 1970, he was a young psychology professor who was originally working with 4-year-olds and then decided even with 4-year-olds it was a little late for some kids. And he began working with pregnant moms up to age 2. He started something called the Nurse-Family Partnership that essentially coaches at-risk, low-income moms on the kind of interventions that are much more natural in middle-class households. It's providing nurses to visit the homes and encouraging the pregnant moms while pregnant, try not to drink, try not to smoke, avoid drugs. In West Virginia right now, 20% of kids are born with drugs in their system. And with these visits, it's not going to go to zero, but it does drop. One can improve these outcomes. One can have the moms talk more to their kids. They hug their kids more. They are more wary of lead-based paints that cause lead poisoning, both prenatally and in infancy. And the upshot is quite remarkable because it is at this beginning of life when leverage is greatest. And so even though the program ends at age 2, 13 years later at age 15, those kids, in a randomized control trial, the gold standard of evaluation, 13 years later, those teenagers are only half as likely to have been arrested. Only half as likely. And the RAND Corporation found that these interventions for the most at-risk kids, they pay for themselves. Every $1 invested reduces spending later on by $6.70. Essentially, we can pay at the front end, or we can pay at the back end with juvenile detention, which is incredibly expensive. And yet, here you have an intervention that is kind of the gold standard, has as robust an evidence base as any other, and it only reaches 2 to 3% of the kids who need it in this country. And that is just so frustrating that in this country, we always seem to reach to pluck the high-hanging fruit and not the low-hanging fruit like this. And, to some degree, it's similar abroad. For those of you who read Half the Sky, you know that Cheryl and I believe deeply that internationally you get some of the best leverage through girls' education. And one of my frustrations since 9/11, having spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan, is that I think we've overused the military toolbox and underused the education toolbox and the women's empowerment toolbox in bringing about change in societies. And none of these toolboxes are perfect. And the military toolbox obviously works better in a short time frame. Over a longer time frame, education toolbox, women's empowerment, has a pretty good record of transforming societies over time. And the trade-offs are enormous. For the price of deploying one U.S. soldier abroad for 1 year, you can start about 20 schools and fund them for 3 years. So there's a real trade-off there. And I want to show you a clip now of A Path Appears documentary, which will air on PBS beginning in late January. It's a school we also write about in the book. We have a chapter about it in the book. It's a school in a slum in Nairobi, Kenya, that was started by this extraordinary young man from the slum, Kennedy Odede, who got no formal education at all, was homeless for much of his childhood, self-taught, and then Wesleyan accepted him as a college student, even though he'd had no formal education until that point. He thrived at Wesleyan, was the student commencement speaker, went back, and with a young woman from Colorado with whom he'd fallen in love, they started this incredible school in Kibera, in this slum, with some of the poorest and most disadvantaged kids in Kenya. An English school. It's called Kibera School for Girls, beginning very, very young. And this is a poem that you're going to see that was written by one of those girls. Her name is Eunice. Here's Eunice.
Eunice Akoth presents my dream. Welcome. I have a dream that will never fail. Every mighty king was once a crying baby. Every great tree was once a tiny seed, and so is my dream. This journey seems so long, yet I will not waver. The path has stones all over, but I will not give up. Every day of my life is a page of my history. Every step that I take is a move to my glorious destiny. It's not where I am, but where I'm going that matters. Now listen. Listen carefully to the words of wisdom. Stop watching your dreams go down the drain. Fight fearlessly like a wounded lion. For it's not about who you are, but how you see yourself. So dream. Thank you.
Isn't that awesome? So that's Eunice, who will be a star in the documentary in January. Now, one bit of pushback I sometimes get, and I'm sure you do too, in teaching about this, has to do with the question of whether one can really make a difference given how vast the problems are. Now, Eunice is supported by, she's sponsored by American kids, but at the end of the day, she's one child, and there are still 60 million kids worldwide who should be in primary school but aren't. And so anything one does can seem a little bit like a drop in the bucket. I'm something of a believer in drops in the bucket, though, and that's partly because of my own family history and story. I want to show you this image you see on the screen. This is of Vladislav Kristofovich, a refugee from Romania. This is shortly after World War II. He fled Romania. He ended up in Yugoslavia and then France. Wanted to come to the U.S. and he, in Paris, was cleaning hotel rooms. One of the rooms he cleaned belonged to a young American woman who was working for the Marshall Plan. She convinced her parents in the U.S. to sponsor Kristofovich's way to the U.S. They had never met him. They didn't know anything much about him, but they sponsored him. And look, this was exactly a drop in the bucket. This did not solve the global refugee problem. This did not make a dent in the global refugee problem. But it was completely transformative for him, for Vladislav Kristof, and ultimately for me as well, because he, after coming to the U.S., he decided that Kristofovich was much too complicated a name for the U.S. It had 3 Z's, and so we shortened it to Kristof. That's my dad. And ultimately, I think that is one reason why I've come to believe in the power of drops in the bucket, believe that it's drops in the bucket that end up filling buckets, and that's how we bring about change. So with that, I'd like to invite you to ask questions and make this more of a discussion. Thanks very much for having me here, and thanks for all you're doing in the field. Thanks a lot, and there are 3 microphones right here, and so just come up and ask. Yes?
I just have a question about your dad. I met him many years ago, and if you could just comment, I'm a geographer, he was a geographer, and how did that affect a geography teacher in Portland, and how did it affect the way you view the world globally?
So, you know, I really do think that the way parents shape us, or the way adults shape kids generally, is not through what they say, but through their modeling of behavior. And my dad was constantly, it wasn't his lectures over the dinner table, it was his intellectual curiosity about the world. And the conversations we had, the fact that we were surrounded by books, I think that did shape my curiosity about the world. And ultimately, I think that often, it's very easy for kids growing up to create this sharp divide between us and them. And, us as Americans, and then we otherize people in other countries, other nationalities, other races, religions, whatever it may be. And when your dad has an accent, is from somewhere else in the world, it becomes much harder to otherize people. And I think that is maybe the most basic thing that I absorbed from my quite amazing dad. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your writing, I appreciate it. I was wondering if you could speak about the articles that you wrote about white privilege and the responses you have, and sort of maybe your process in writing the articles and maybe where you are now.
Sure. So for those who don't know, after Ferguson, I wrote one article, what I thought was going to be one article, which was really about implicit bias. And one of the things I've really learned is that it seems to me that the problem of racial inequality in this country is not so much about hardline white racists who don't believe in equality, but rather I think the deeper problem is of well-meaning people who believe deeply at some level in racial equality, who don't believe in discrimination, who are proud of racial progress, and yet are unaware of their own biases and act on biases of which they are unaware of. And the social psychology literature underscores how deep these biases are, and they indeed affect not only whites but also blacks. I think likewise that gender inequality is not so much a function of misogynists, but rather of all kinds of men and indeed women who make decisions that are biased without ever meaning to. And you see this in research where people send out the same resume with a characteristically black name and a white name, so to speak, and the white name version of that same resume gets many, many more callbacks, or with a male name and a female name, and the male name gets more callbacks. You see this in many ways, and I think that we need to kind of understand the degree to which we ourselves are the problem. And the only way to do that is to have conversations about this and to face this. And so I wrote one column about this originally, and well, my readers were unhappy. and so then I wrote what I thought was going to be, then I wrote a column, When Whites Just Don't Get It. And and there was again a lot of pushback, and so that led to When Whites Just Don't Get It Part 2, and so the most recent installment was When Whites Just Don't Get It Part 4, and there may be a Part 5 coming as well. And I guess the single thing that strikes me the most is this issue of personal responsibility. And, on the one hand, it's real. I mean, there are real issues of self-destructive behaviors. And this is true internationally, and this is true domestically. And I see this partly because, as Peggy said earlier, I'm from a place in rural Oregon that was a blue-collar area dependent on manufacturing and timber. The economy kind of went apart. The union jobs there, the factory jobs disappeared, and over the last 40 years or so, it has been kind of devastating what has happened as those jobs have fled. And there has been a huge surge in methamphetamines. So many men, including guys I grew up with, ended up running afoul of the law. Once you have a felony conviction, you become largely unemployable. You become less marriageable. You saw a surge of family breakdowns. Was there self-destructive behavior embedded in some of that? Absolutely. But while calling for personal responsibility there, I think we have to do two things. We have to acknowledge that when people feel hopeless, that people are much more likely to make that hopelessness self-fulfilling by engaging in self-destructive behaviors. And likewise, that we can't demand that other people show personal responsibility when we as a society fail them systematically in providing support, whether that support be early childhood interventions or training programs or other things that we know work, or birth control support for these teenage girls who don't want to get pregnant, and yet we don't help them, and in many cases don't even provide them with comprehensive sex education in school. So I think we need to be a little less judgmental and a little more helpful, and this would leave everybody better off. So that's kind of one of the basic points I've been trying to drum through with my series, but I can't say that I've been getting a lot of letters from readers saying, "Oh boy, you're absolutely right. Now I see things entirely differently." That has not been the tenor of my email. Let's see, I guess.
Hi, thanks for your work. And I just wanted to take 30 seconds to tell you about how I read your book about 6 years ago, and then I gave it to a student, and I told her this is going to rock your world. She read it in a week, and it rocked her world. And she started a club on our campus called New Global Citizens, which you guys can all check out downstairs in the exhibit hall. Little plug there.
Great.
And we also need more Half the Sky DVDs, by the way. And she put on these events to raise money for, the club did, for Afghan Institute of Learning, which is in the book, called Poetry Nights. Once we donated the money, Sekena Yakubi heard about that, and they did some of their own in Afghanistan, and she even met this student in DC.
Wow.
It was pretty cool story. And then she's in college now, and she wrote me an email about a year ago and said, I don't know about Kristof anymore, kind of stuff. She's studying she's in the School of Foreign Service, and in my conversation with her about that, it was because of things like, I guess maybe some overzealous people out here, like groups like Invisible Children, for example, very well-meaning and things like that, but some of the things that they were advocating, the international development community, in academia anyway, probably wouldn't have recommended some of those policies and suggestions. And I guess my question to you is, you speak to the little people out here. You don't speak, the academic journals and things like that, but you get the stories about the developing world to average readers. What do you want us to do with that? Do you recommend that the best way to make an impact is to plug into actual organizations that already exist, on the ground there, and let those in the academic world of international development kind of guide all that, or should all of the little grassroots people here rise up and go out there and save the world?
Well, first, thank you for introducing your students to it. And I should mention that if any teachers are interested in using A Path Appears in the classroom while it is still a hardback, then the Edmund McConnell Clark Foundation has provided funds to subsidize the difference between the paperback price and the hardback cost, and so your class can get it for essentially a paperback price. And we haven't quite figured out a good way of figuring out how to, there's an email address of the person you could contact, and I posted it on my Facebook page a few days ago. It's something like Lex Libris at Earthlink. But if you go to my Facebook page a few days ago, you can see a posting about it. So if any of you are looking for cheaper copies of A Path Appears, you can get it foundation subsidized that way. I'm a huge believer in social entrepreneurs, and I think there are some who have done just amazing things. But I also do think that one of the things that has held back the nonprofit sector generally, and we write about it in A Path Appears, is that there are so many of these tiny startups that never scale up. And so my advice to, everybody wants to be a founder of something. So our advice to somebody who is contemplating starting something new is, count to 10 before you start something new. See if there is an existing organization that is already doing what you want to do, and it may be more helpful to everybody if you take advantage of their existing operation and help scale it up. Now, if nobody else is doing it, then, sure, by all means, go and start your own thing. But don't just intuitively think that you should always be starting your own thing. And the companion question we always get is about addressing needs in this country versus addressing needs in the rest of the world. And there's a point of view that we should solve our own problems first before we worry about other countries. And I don't buy that. It's much more cost-effective to send a kid to school or save a life elsewhere than it is in this country. And I also fundamentally think that our empathy and our compassion shouldn't depend on the color of somebody's skin or the color of their passport. But I also do think that in the US, especially among kind of middle-class students, it has sometimes become kind of cool to go and do a service learning project abroad or to sponsor, do something international, and not cool in the same way to mentor a kid or tutor a kid on the wrong side of the tracks in your own community. And I think that likewise is short-sighted, that there are tremendous needs right here in the U.S., and there are tremendous needs abroad. We should be able to address both, and they don't have to compete with each other. You know, different people will reach out to something else, and we can address both. We don't need to prioritize one over the other.
Hey, I just wanted to come back to the issue of women empowerment and how it really can help with economic development on a global scale. I agree wholeheartedly with what you've said, but you know, if we look at current events right now, if we look at kind of the resurgence of groups like ISIS, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, their treatment of women. If we look at theocracies around the world, many of them who are our allies, right, and their treatment of women, how do we reconcile our vision for women empowerment with, let's say, for example, their religious traditions, which I do not agree with.
Right.
I'm not trying to say by any means.
Sort of cultural imperialism issues.
Right. How do we not seem like we're coming? You know, because I agree with you. We need to empower. I mean, there are clear links. You know, with empowering women and, you know, for example, birth rate dropping and stuff like that. But how do we do that without the cultural imperialism?
You know, it's a valid question. One of the things that has really, I think, impaired our efforts at girls' education abroad, and certainly in combating female genital mutilation abroad, has been this sense of, you know, that we are marching in and telling people to do things that they feel are antithetical to their culture or in some cases to their faith. And I do think that the answer to that is that we need to do a better job of empowering local change makers. You know, in Afghanistan, where I've reported plenty of times, we can build a girls' school somewhere, a nice brick building somewhere, and in southern Afghanistan, that just puts a taint on it right away. By far and if we put, you know, gift of the people of the USA on it, that'll kill it. The best folks at doing girls' education in places like Afghanistan are, well, for example, there's a Bangladeshi aid group called BRAC, you know, and since Bangladesh is a Muslim country, it's much less threatening. They can work with local Taliban commanders. They can negotiate, okay? Often the Taliban commanders will let girls be educated if they use Pakistani textbooks, but not Afghan government textbooks. Or they'll want to have negotiate, and there'll be some Quran classes in there, as well as a secular education. So if we can empower some of these local Afghan folks, and, you know, where nothing else works, if you have literacy classes in the mosque, that helps inoculate it against this kind of a backlash. I do think there are ways we can address it, but we have to be sensitive to how these are perceived. I think it can be done, though. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I'm afraid we have time for just one more question. I'm really sorry about that. I will afterward be at book signing somewhere. You may know better than I do. But we only have a minute left, and so I'll...
Okay, you talked about privilege. I teach my students about white privilege, male privilege, middle-class privilege, which I personally believe education is very biased toward middle-class privilege. And my students get it. And that's why, even teenagers I teach in high school, they get it. They're very open-minded. It's the adults I have a problem with. They're so resistant. I can't get through to them. And so I'm talking about, when I talk about these things with my family and my friends, what do you recommend for adults? It seems like all you do is offend them, like you're attacking them when you talk about privilege instead of trying to help them see something else.
You know, the best recommendation I can offer comes instead of a lesson I learned when I was writing about Darfur a decade ago. I was making my reporting trips to Darfur, covering these massacres, mass rape, And it was very frustrating because it felt like the columns were disappearing without a ripple. And meanwhile, at the same time in New York, if you may remember, there were two red-tailed hawks that were living in Central Park. And they had a nest in an apartment building on the edge of Central Park, and the building didn't like the bird droppings, so it dismantled their nest. And all New York was up in arms about the homelessness of these two hawks. And I felt, how is it that I can't generate the same outrage over hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered? And that led me to the work of one social psychologist in particular, Paul Slovic, who looks at what makes us connect with the cause, what makes us feel empathetic. And it's not a rational process. It's an emotional process. It's about individual stories. We are, to some degree, hardwired to feel empathy for a particular person, but not for a class of people. And so the moment you increase it from the number of people in the class, then that empathy drops. And in fact, that begins when the number of victims goes from 1 to 2 people are less empathetic. And if you ask people in social psychology experiments, if you ask them to do math problems, and then you ask them to donate, they donate less because the more rational parts of their brain are to the fore. It's really an emotional connection. And so the only thing I can say is kind of storytelling, the same thing that led people to, 3,000 years ago to feel sympathy for and empathy for the people of Troy, even though they were Greeks. It's about storytelling about individuals. And I think video in particular and pictures are powerful. That's why in both Half the Sky and A Path Appears, both in the book and the doc, we try to do a lot of these storytelling to try to chip away at these constructs whereby we try to insulate ourselves to protect our own narrative. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Nicholas Kristof. The book signing will be in the NCSS bookstore on the second level, Michael. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for supporting NCSS and hearing our wonderful speaker.
Our new project is called A Path Appears. A prominent Chinese writer said that hope is like a path in the countryside. At first, there is no path, but as more people walk again and again, a path appears, meaning a solution appears. It's about innovative strategies for making a difference. In Half the Sky, we were asking, how do you begin to tackle seemingly insurmountable problems?
Is that red door, is that a brothel, do we think?
Yes, it is.
Stay safe, okay?
In A Path Appears, we take it to a new level. We actually look at the roots of vulnerability, and we talk about solutions that really address those roots.
It's easier to look at problems outside the country than it is to look at stuff in our own backyard.
More than 100,000 girls are sold for sex in some form each year.
In the United States?
In the U.S.
Nick and Cheryl use stories to capture attention.
That's the signal. Police, you're under arrest, okay?
Because stories are powerful.
That's her?
That's Naomi.
From Haiti to Chicago, from Colombia to Kenya to Boston, the central problem as we see it is poverty.
This trailer is a home where they said they may have 14 people at a time.
It's overwhelming. I don't know if I've seen this much despair before.
At any given moment, it could turn ugly and violent.
Cheryl and I are sharing real human stories of struggle, challenge, and transformation.
Oh, wow.
It all goes back to early childhood intervention in this country and, of course, around the world.
As we take our journey, we're going to be inviting along actors to try to highlight not just the problems, but the ways to chip away at them.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a survivor of all forms of sexual abuse, including incest and rape, and about that, I have no shame.
I feel like I've discovered this darkness that lives in our country.
Más adelante y sí se puedes hacer todo que quieres en tu corazón, ¿vale? Y tú vas a hacer, ¿no? Sí. Sí. Oh.
Our world is now a global village.
We can change the course of history. We can set these young children onto a much more promising path.
One girl at a time, yay.
What you have to do is dream about the future and have hope for the future, and that's how the future changes.
I know I can save you. Just say something. Just open your mouth and tell me so that I can fix it. There is a solution. It's just up to us to care.
Everyone, everywhere, can have an impact. Through hope, we can achieve our dreams.
A path appears